So I want to talk to our children who are present this morning. And when you came down from your bedrooms this morning, it was very easy. You knew where all the presents were that Santa had delivered, right? Where did you find the presents? In your stockings. In your stockings. So it was very easy. You found them. They were kind of like in one place. So sometimes Santa and our parents and our friends will put presents under the tree. So it's very easy to find the presents, right? And we open them, and it's very easy. But as we get older, the presents that are given to us are maybe not so easy to find. They're not in the stockings or under the tree. They're often hidden in mysterious places, in places that may be hard to find. And the story that I just read from this very ancient Bible, which is a wonderful tradition, it was in the old church. And you think of the different generations that have sat where you have sat, where you sit now, right? And they hear that story and all of the things as they're searching, what is the meaning of this baby Jesus story all about, right? And we're all here, we're all trying to figure out what this Jesus story is all about for us. And it's a present to the world. God is giving the world this present of this little human being who's going to... We know the story. We know what his life is going to be about. But the shepherds didn't know that. Mary and Joseph didn't know that. And in fact, it was a very difficult present to understand at the beginning. And I think about, if this story happened in modern day, it might have been much easier for Mary and Joseph. Maybe Joseph could have filed his taxes online and saved himself and his poor pregnant wife a lot of trouble, right? And maybe if he knew he had to turn up in person for the census, he could have booked an Airbnb close to the children's hospital where the Savior of the world could have been delivered into the world in a wonderful way, right? And going into the story a little further, the wise men who journey, it's interesting, there's a wonderful joke about if it had been wise women, they would have found their way there much faster than the men. But the wise men got a little lost, and it was a difficult journey. It took them a long time to find this present. And maybe if it was in a modern time, they would have used GPS. It saved a lot of time. They were busy, powerful people, right? So one is left with a lot of questions. Why is the journey, why is the searching for the present so difficult? Why does it have to be that way? And there was a poet, an English poet called T.S. Eliot in 1927. And the context of his commission, he was given a commission to write a poem about Christmas. And in those days, Christmas was kind of smushy. It was kind of sentimental. And it was Christmas cards with little cute churches and snow and reindeers and Santa Claus and everything. And it's interesting that in 1927, he wrote this poem where he imagined what it was really like for the people who were trying to find the present of Jesus. And he wrote a poem called The Journey of the Magi, the journey of these kings. And in the poem, he talks about how difficult the journey was. He talks about they leave their palaces and their nice, warm, cozy places where they have servants, and they journey into the unknown, and there's nowhere to stay, and the camels are grumpy, and it's just awful. And there's this little voice in their head saying, this is all a waste of time. This is all a waste of time. It's folly. And they find their way to Bethlehem, and they ask a couple of strangers, and they point them in the direction of the stable, and then they go and they see this little baby. And then they realize that he represents the end of their era. They're not they're pagans. They're worshiping idols. They're worshiping other gods. And so the birth of this little baby represents a kind of ending. And so the poem ends with this very interesting kind of question. What did we come here? Was it to come to discover a birth, or was it a kind of death? There's a kind of death that we are experiencing. We have to let go of something that we didn't necessarily expect. So it's a kind of our present, but it's got two sides to it. There's a joy in it that we have discovered something mysterious and beautiful that God, the mystery we call God, is offering to us. But we've also discovered something that's about a big change in the world. And so the poem talks about, they go back to their palaces and they're not the same. They're kind of uneasy with who they are. And it ends with, what did we find a birth or a death? Who knows? So the poem ends with a question. But what was very brave of T.S. Eliot was that he entered into the kind of cultural sentimentalization of Christmas. And he introduced a very important theme, which is about, in the quest for finding the things that are really, really valuable in life, it's often about difficulty. It's never given to us on a plate. And it's wonderful when we find the presents in the stockings and under the tree. And somehow, as we get older and as we experience life more, and we don't have our parents and people around us to protect us, we realize that this is the way life is. It just is. And that somehow, how do we find God? How do we find God? How do we find God in the muck and the mire of life? And in the difficulties of the journey? And how do we find God when the little voice is saying, this is all nonsense. You're wasting your time. Right? And we've all got those little voices all the time. And those little voices, that's about faith, actually. People are confused that faith is about certainty. Well, I know everything and it's just all clear and here we are and da-da-da-da-da. That's not faith. Faith is often we're lost and we're going to put one foot in front of the other and somehow we're going to take the next step to that journey and we're going to try and find that which we are searching for. During the last couple of weeks at St. Peter's, we've had this season of Advent, 4 weeks, and we asked 4 members of our congregation to tell us what love incarnate meant to them. And it was very interesting. Nastia put the program together, so between the services, between the 8 o'clock service and the 9:30, we had about a half an hour for people just to tell stories of their journeys. And it was really interesting as a way to prepare for how does love become incarnate in the 21st century. And Nastia started the series off by talking about her journey from Russia, a little community called, not little actually, it's 1 million people, same size as Belfast, big city, Perm in Russia, and she gets a scholarship or she gets invitation as an international exchange student to come and live in Alabama. And she gets to meet Americans and she gets to worship differently. And then she gets an invitation and works her way to get a degree at Dickinson College. And that she sees her role as an international ambassador, a kind of bridge builder between different countries, which is a very important role these days, right? And she finds herself living here in Millbrook with 4 other people. All have an interesting kind of international theme. One young lady is Muslim. She's worked in Afghanistan. She was a bridge between the US military and the Afghan people using basketball as a way of reconciliation. So she's living here. Another young man from Venezuela who studied political science here. And he talked about what it's like to watch your country fall apart and go into civil war. And he talks about how maybe he won't be able to return for 20 years to his own country. And what is that about? What is that about? And so these young people are they're working in Cardinal Hayes' home, they're working in the Carey Institute, Nastia is working here at St. Peter's. We have people working at Grace Church, and they are incarnating love in our community. So that was Nastia's insight about her journey, and what she's searching for was really insightful. The second person, Will Hitchcock. Hitchcock family is well known in this community. So his family, they're connected to a very interesting project in Tanzania. It's a school and a hospital. And this American woman went over there, and with her friends and supporters, they've created this amazing village that is transforming the lives of people the other side of the world. And he talked about that. And he talked about it was really important in his life as he was struggling with his own issues and dealing with being a parent and dealing with faith, that this project was a kind of mirror of a transformation that was going on in his own life. Beautiful story. And he showed us pictures of these children. Wonderful. Third person, John Allen. John had a very successful career. He headed up SOS, which is the largest international children's program in the world. He retired from that, and he was looking for something to do. And one night over dinner, his wife said, well, why don't you do something here, something to do with children? And so he found out that there's a big problem with the children of incarcerated women in this country. That if you're put in prison, maybe 5 years, 7 years, because prisons are often in really isolated places, these children never see their mother again, or years. And how do you communicate? If you haven't seen your child for 3 years, how do you start talking to them? And so John really got into this, and he was talking to people at the grassroots level. He was talking to the commissioner of prisons. He was going through the state. He was trying to understand what the problem was. And the concept that he's come up with is to create villages where children can go to school, be educated, be loved by the community, and be close to those prisons where their mothers are incarcerated. And so he's really exploring that. It's an extraordinary project. And it was all about how can we help the children? What's good for the children? And often he says there is this cycle, that this continuation of children are so distraught by this experience that they often end up themselves in criminal activities and often end up themselves in prison. So this was a kind of way to break that cycle. It made total sense. And lots of people just went, this is a great idea, John. How can we help you? How can we support you? Love incarnate. And then the final witness, our Advent messengers, was Juliet Heyer, who's a wonderful member of our congregation. And she talked about 12 years volunteering at the St. Thomas's Food Pantry in Armenia. And she volunteers with many, many people in this community, many different shops and organizations that contribute food. They have a garden, they grow food, and they see people who are largely invisible to us. People who are kind of ashamed that they don't have enough to eat. And she told stories of people who live in their cars because they lost their job. A man who has to get food because all the money that he has is going to pay for his wife's health insurance co-payments. Right? So lots of reasons why people... And this year, St. Thomas's provided 67,000 meals for local families in our community. Extraordinary. Extraordinary. And the need for more volunteers. And many of us support St. Thomas's, the money that we raise together for the Promises event. And many of you contributed to that. We raised $45,000. That's going to help this community. But they also need, Juliet says, we need volunteers. We need people to step forward. And for her, this is love incarnate. Right? That love translates from a kind of idea into action, into concrete. And I think that's really powerful. I think that, and it was so inspiring to hear from you all what love incarnate means today in the 21st century. And that what all of those stories had in common was that that little birth in the Bethlehem stable, the light that shone out of that little stable, that little baby, entered their heart and changed the way they saw their place in the world, and that they wanted to continue the love of God in the world. And so, let's think about that in our own lives. What does that mean? What does that mean for us as Jesus? Because God loves the world, but there's so much that is broken in the world. And so God is inviting us in this moment, in this Bethlehem moment, to see a way that we can help to heal and to renew and to love that world into repair, into a different way of being. The other journey that we make, it's not only to Bethlehem today, but there's a journey that we make inside, which is the most important journey any of us will do. I love in the gospel today, we have today the gospel for Christmas Day is a little longer than the gospel we read last night. And it includes that wonderful phrase that when the shepherds come and they're, rejoicing, and they probably have had a couple of drinks and they're having a really good time, and Mary is pondering all these things in her heart. Right? She's trying to figure it out. What's going on here? She ponders, and that's an inward journey that we're all invited to go on. This past week, one of my parishioners, who doesn't live here anymore, but she sent me a wonderful quote by a preacher. He's dead now, but a writer, an author and preacher called Frederick Buechner. And Freddie apparently has connections here. Mimi told me that there's connections with him in this community. But he was once asked, do you envision a particular audience when you write? And he replied, I always hope to reach people who don't want to touch religion with a 10-foot pole. The cultured despisers of religion, he calls them. And one of his themes in his writings, and I'm going to get in more to his books. He wrote about 30 books. And one of the themes that is really central to his theology is about paying attention. Simple. It's all about paying attention. Pay attention to your life, to the people in our lives, to whom we are closest, the things that are happening to you right now in the real life, because in those relationships and in those experiences, God is present. But often, like the hidden presence, we have to kind of search for it. It's not obvious at the time. The little voices, it's kind of folly. Or there's no purpose to this. And he says, Buechner says, this is the best and most authentic way to experience ourselves and God. He says this, you never know what may cause them. The sight of the Atlantic Ocean can do it, or a piece of music, or a face you've never seen before. A pair of somebody's old shoes can do it. You can never be sure. But of this you can be sure, whenever you find tears in your eyes, especially unexpected tears, it is well to pay the closest attention. They are not only telling you something about the secret of who you are, but more often than not, God is speaking to you through them of the mystery of where you've come from, and is summoning you to where, if your soul is to be saved, where you should go next. I love that. And many of us are frightened of that journey, right? We're frightened to pay attention. We busy ourselves. We have distractions. And in the end, theology is liberated from the ivory towers of seminaries and from pulpits. I'm 6 foot above contradiction. We're liberated from that because ultimately theology is autobiographical. Right? It's about how God is in here and how the in here connects. like those stories of Advent that I told, that are transforming and blessing God's world, and they all come from this moment, from this Bethlehem, from this stable. So we are in Bethlehem once again. What is it we have come to find? A birth or a death? Who knows? Amen.